Okay, let's get started. We have a lot to cover today, and I wanted to thank you all for attending our presentation today. For those of you, I recognize a bunch of you, but for those of you I haven't had a chance to meet before, my name is Christine Perfetti, and I'm the founding principal of a company called Perfetti Media outside of Arlington, Virginia. And the way I describe myself, I'm at my core a researcher. I've spent the last 20 plus years learning how people make decisions and watching how they work and talking with them. Beyond conducting research, my other passion is making sure that research drives action and outcomes. So I spend the majority of my time sharing with teams and working with teams to find out about their users and make decisions that will make a huge impact with their business and their products and hopefully their lives. What we're going to talk today, and I'll pass it over to my colleague Andrew Duchon in a second, but we're very excited to talk to you about our explorations of AI we were asking each other, when do we start this collaboration? We've worked together over the years, but this particular collaboration we'll be sharing with you was a 6-week whirlwind. So we'll be sharing some of what we've learned during that time. So just some logistics before I pass it over to Andrew to introduce himself. We are going to share both the video recording and the slides after this presentation. So I'll be sending out an email with all of the materials. So feel free to feverishly take notes, but you don't have to. We'll be sending out the materials. We also are making a point to stop at several times during the session so you can ask questions. Andrew, when I'm speaking, we'll be looking at what questions come up in the chat window. And when Andrew's sharing, I'll be doing the same. So if you do have questions, please chat away in the window. We'd love to hear what you'd like to learn. Any questions that come up, please put those in the window and we'll try to cover as much as we can. In terms of thinking about all of this work, I have a little hidden secret for all of you. We positioned this session, and I positioned it as is, and it will be, thinking about how, as a researcher, whether you work in product or marketing, how you start integrating AI into your use cases. That's a big priority. What we're also going to talk a lot about is that UX professionals, marketing professionals, and UX researchers have another huge opportunity right now in this new frontier of AI. It's integrating AI into our work, but it's also working with other teams and seeing how they work and starting to provide recommendations on how we use these models. So little lens here. We're going to talk about the use cases that I've put to the test, but I'd also like to start taking the lens and hearing from all of you how you're planning on using it. So with that, the premise behind the collaboration that Andrew and I have gone through. So Andrew and I have known each other for a very long time. We met in graduate school at Brown University. I'm supposed to just say way back, but in the late 90s. So I like to think of us as seasoned professionals. But we met, Andrew is a cognitive scientist. I was studying experimental psychology in graduate school. So we met a long time ago, but we've been in touch all along. But we've also started working on this collaboration over the last month or two around AI, given that I have my background of 25 plus years in user research, and Andrew's been a cognitive scientist for a long time. This was a nice opportunity to work together and collide. So with that, Andrew, I believe I muted you, but would you like to introduce yourself? I'm sorry I described us as old.
Yeah, that's why I chose the black and white. Great picture there. Yeah, I've been working with neural networks off and on for over 30 years. And from early speech recognition work when I was in Japan to my work at Brown University and a few other occasions in between. And then, yeah, recently with the explosion of AI, I've been trying to stay on top of everything, which is very hard, in all things generative, text, video, images, and I've done work in all of those. And so when Christine came to me, just what's going on here? I was very happy to help her kind of understand things. And so a lot of this is what she has learned from me, and she's done a lot of research on her own as well, as you'll see. And so, yeah, please enjoy her presentation. And if you have any more technical questions, you can put those into the chat for me, and I'll try to answer those later.
Yes, Andrea will answer all of the highly technical questions. So thank you. So a little bit more background. So Andrew's absolutely right. I reached out to him, and a little bit more of the backstory here. So in my work as a researcher, I'm working quite a bit with product leaders, design leaders, UX marketing leaders, and now a good friend, but also a product leader, Carrie Coe, and I were talking about late last year, and she was asking me how I've integrated AI into my processes. And I said, what do you mean? I have not at all. So I also have to thank her. I think Carrie may join the session. But here's the scoop. What are we going to talk about and what have we learned? Andrew's absolutely, he's my go-to expert to learn all things about what's happening on the back end and what's happening technically. I'm taking the perspective of running research for 20 plus years. What recommendations, first, as I played with the tools and the models, what I learned, but what recommendations I see in terms of my work, what recommendations researchers may want to consider. Now, I want to preface everything that I say. It's based on how I approach my research work and how I plan to use these models. It's really going to, right now in this new frontier, it's going to be up to all of us as practitioners to decide what works for us. So I'll share my experience going through this whirlwind tour of the models with the goal of giving you my perspective, having done this for a very long time. But the real priority here, and I mentioned this while I was announcing we were doing this, is to encourage all of you, if you haven't done it yet, spend 10 hours integrating these tools into your workflow. And the reason for that is just by doing that, you're going to have so much expertise and proficiency in these tools. So with that, my priority, I reached out to Andrew after talking with Carrie quite a bit about how I might integrate AI. I reached out to Andrew, it was only in early April, so it's about 6 weeks ago. And I said for him a proposal. Could we meet every day for 4 days, where every day we'll talk about these models, but I'll start putting them to use. So after every day we meet, I'll start trying new use cases. What's really nice about this, and I can show you, is I actually had a real data set I could play with. So I've been running some independent research aside from my client work. I put some of my data sets to the test. So we'll walk through some of those examples. And my goal here was to first test out the models, see which ones worked most effectively for me, but it also gave me a lens for thinking about where would I want to use these tools or not. The models I have played with to a high degree have been ChatGPT 4, Claude 3, and Gemini. Admittedly, of those three, I've explored Gemini the least, and I'll talk a little bit about that. It's not that there's anything wrong with Gemini, but I wanted to start with a couple of the frontier models. So we'll be seeing a lot of screenshots of ChatGPT 4 and Claude, and let's get right into it. There's some implications I'd like to take here. So today we're going to talk about how these AI tools were integrated into my process and how I thought it affected the quality of my work and my research process. There's another lens I'd love you all to keep in mind, and we'll talk about it just a little bit today. As I mentioned, as researchers and social scientists and leaders in our industry, we're going to talk about our use cases, but I would like to spend a little bit of time talking about what the implications are legally and ethically, in addition to the quality of our work. The reason for that is, as a first step of becoming proficient with these tools, start with your use cases. But once you're pretty proficient, this is where I think we as UX product professionals and researchers could start doing the research to talk with others and watch others and see how they're using these models. We have a real opportunity in the UX and product space to be leading the show and driving decisions. So there's a couple of opportunities here. I wanted to preface on the right, the lovely imagery. This is DALL-E at work. Didn't iterate with it at all, but it was my first playing a little bit with ChatGPT 4 to generate images. I put it up here to share with you. First, we're not talking about how to generate images today, but also to say you can start just exploring, seeing how these work for you. What you're seeing here on the right is just a little prompt I put into the ChatGPT 4 window to have a nice little image for the presentation. To preface and say, we're not talking about DALL-E today for the most part. Okay, so here's what I'm going to ask all of you to do. I'm curious if you could put in the chat window, because I'd love to have a sense of how much experience you all have with these tools. My hypothesis is a bunch of you are already exploring a bit with your workflow, but if you could just put in the chat window so Andrew can be seeing the level of experience you have, how much you've been working with these tools so far. And the reason for this is, getting started with ChatGPT 4, and that's where I started. The first thing I did, can't recommend enough, a book by Ethan Mollick called Co-Intelligence. It was my starting point into this journey with AI. And there's something that now, after my tour of these models, I fundamentally, wholeheartedly agree with what he said, that as a skilled, experienced practitioner, if you can spend 10 hours with one of these models, you're going to be one of the experts in the space. So if you haven't spent 10 hours yet, my ask of all of you is, after this presentation, you should have enough information and skills to go off and explore one of these models with your use cases for 10 hours. And guess what? You're going to have a whole lot to say, as much, if not even more than I shared today after those 10 hours. And the goal here is, there's such an ecosystem of tools out there, especially looking at research tools in the AI space. I recommend that you start with one of these large language models, one of these LLMs, one of the frontier tools. And the reason for this is, it starts giving you a sense of what's happening here and what's happening behind the scenes. And before you even start exploring some of the tools that are customized to our use cases, it's a great opportunity for you to get experience with the frontier models and get the foundation. So I'd recommend you start there if you haven't worked with these tools at all yet. The goal is, the more you can learn these the more you work with these models, the more proficient you're going to be. And just as importantly, you can start having a conversation and be part of the discourse of where AI should be going within our industry and other industries. So here was my deep dive. This is beginning of April. I reached out to Andrew. He's the most knowledgeable neural network expert I know. And we started our 4-day boot camp. What's also really fascinating about this, my boot camp was really exploratory. I didn't take any in-depth training up until the last couple of weeks ago. So I was just coming in, having a little tutorial for about a half hour with Andrew every day, and then I was playing. And I'd actually encourage all of you to just start if you haven't. And the reason for this is, once you start thinking about your processes and your workflow, and you pick one of these models and you start putting in prompts, you're going to learn and grow and get better. So don't hesitate to start, even if you haven't gone into any training. Just dive right in. So my journey, I'm calling it my journey from 0 to 60. Before all of you joined, Andrew and I were chatting a little bit, and from my perspective, it's remarkable where I've gotten to from beginning of April to now. But what's also so remarkable is how much I feel like I still don't know about these models. So I'm at like a 60. I've learned enough to understand how I'm going to start working with the models, but there's still so much to learn. I'll talk a little bit about my journey now after this little week-long boot camp with Andrew, some of the other training and the things that I'll be wanting to learn. What I've put on this slide, and I'll share it with all of you, is by no means the only way you can get started, but it's an approach that I've seen work in terms of thinking through how you get started to go from 0 to 60 with one of the frontier models. The first thing I'd suggest is learn the basics. AI 101. This isn't something that takes weeks. It takes a couple of hours, where you learn the language, you learn the difference between an LLM frontier model versus the AI tools. You learn what a GPT is. What's a GPT versus ChatGPT? You're going to learn all of this language. So it gives you the foundation to know where to start. So learn the basics. Then next step, as researchers, if you are conducting qualitative research in-house, you'll want to consider the specific process you use for your research and think through your process today, because once you think through what your process is today, you can start pinpointing areas where you want to start playing with the models. So consider your research processes and evaluate where and what opportunities you hypothesize the models can help you with. I started with one use case and tested it well and iterated and refined. And we'll talk about some of those use cases. Some were very simple, some were much more complex in terms of the research process. just start somewhere. Pick one of your use cases where you think that AI may optimize your processes, save you time, possibly increase the quality of your work. Start there. I suggest there's so much discussion about prompting. I think that was the biggest hurdle for me when I first started thinking about exploring AI was how much do I have to know about conversational prompting versus structured prompting, and would it really influence and impact the output I got? What I've learned is just by starting with conversational prompts, what do I mean by that? You, with your regular language, asking these models to do something, just by starting there, you're going to learn a ton and get a wealth of valuable output. This is where the big aspect why I recommend starting with one use case is that you're going to want to iterate and refine over time. As you start seeing how the models will interact with your prompts, you're going to refine your prompts. You're going to find different ways to experiment with the models to get to the output you want. The way I've liked thinking about this, and it's what's been surprising to me quite a bit, when I first started exploring the models, I expected it would feel very much like learning a new technology or tool. Doesn't feel that way at all. It feels really much more learning how to interact with a partner or colleague. It's a conversation. So the one spin, and this is also another excellent tip I got from Ethan Mollick's book, is think about your journey with LLM and these models more as a conversation with a partner who's a piece of your puzzle. And that's really helped me as I'm having these conversations. As you learn and grow, it's in essence, we're not thinking of these tools as people, but you're building a way of interacting with these models over time. And that's been a really great way for me to think about this process. I mentioned Andrew and I spent 4 days together. Let me share a little bit how we started. So I mentioned learn the basics. So first day I sat down with Andrew, we talked for about an hour, and I just was asking him, what's the difference between generative AI versus LLM versus ChatGPT 4 versus all of these research AI tools that were out there? All of these questions that were me basics 101. This is by no means the only way to get started. This is how I did, and it's worked quite well for me. I started with a book that isn't about all the technology. It's about how Gen AI came to be, which is Ethan Mollick's book, Co-Intelligence. Fantastic. I mentioned that during the first couple of weeks, I hadn't taken any training. Since then, I have. Last week, I took an excellent training course by Andrea Knight Dolan, which if you would like a tour of so many different ways to use models to conduct both qualitative and quantitative research, I can't recommend this workshop and training enough. Hidden secret, why did I also attend this course? It was fantastic, but I was still questioning for myself. I've been working with these tools so much to put in conversational prompts, and I've been getting better at more sophisticated prompting, which I'll show you. But one of the reasons I've been going to the training too is to increase my confidence that I'm not missing something along the way. Now, one thing I learned from last week's workshop is that there are experts in our space who are much, much more experienced with prompting. But another thing I learned is this is still so new and we're all willing to share with each other what we're learning. So don't let any amount of not knowing all of the prompting best practices stop you. There's so many resources out there for you. Basics, if you want to start understanding the language of what's generative AI, what's the difference between LLMs. MIT Sloan School has an excellent resource available on here's just the basics. Here's how you get started. Took me about 45 minutes. I went through that. Great start. Carrie, my friend Carrie Coe, also recommended for those of you women out there, there's a fabulous group, Women Defining AI, that's offering tutorials, workshops, empowering women to really get up to speed in this space. There's a lot out there for you. Why I'm sharing this, get started, spend an hour or two. Let me talk a little bit about what Andrew was sharing, and then I'll talk about the level of detail and granularity that I attend to AI. And Andrew, please clarify for me if there's anything additional that you'd want to share. Just the basics. You may all have heard back in 2017, there was a seminal paper that came out from the researchers at Google called Attention is All You Need. And what was so exciting about this paper, it's now 7 years back, is it introduced the notion of the transformer, which was a new way and a new architecture for thinking about how do machines and technology better process human communication. So what do I mean by that? The way I've been thinking about these models and these tools, and this was the conversation we had on day one, Andrew and I had this conversation. So these large language models, the LLMs, are trained on massive amounts of data. We don't know what each of these models have been trained on exactly, but it's a lot. And it's a lot of the data on the internet, it's literature. These LLM models are trained on massive amounts of text. So how do they work? When we're prompting these models, what the models do is that they attend to all of the context window and everything they've been trained on. When we put in our prompts, it predicts based on all of its training and all of the training on text and all of the fine tuning that the companies do to get these models ready. It predicts what the next word will be, or what's known as the next token, which is a word or piece of a word. Based on all of that wealth of information they know, it predicts the probability of what that next word will be. And why does this matter? We talked about attention is all you need. The key words here are these models, why they're frontier models. It's that they're using an attention mechanism. So rather than just predicting the next word based on the last word they see, there's weighted probabilities for these models to figure out what's next. Now, here's the thing that starts getting really, when I show you some of the excitement I had with some of the output, when you hear me define what an LLM is that way, there's a couple of ways you could describe it. So Ethan Mollick in his book, he describes it as an elaborate autofill. Noam Chomsky, the linguistic expert, is not as positive about how he describes an LLM. He describes it as a glorified autofill. And both of them are pretty much right, that what's happening is that these models are trained to predict what word's coming next, but they're not conscious machines. So that's what's happening in a nutshell. Andrew, please elaborate there and share anything that I may have missed or clarify.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, so
Thank you.
the key to thinking about these systems is it's a neural network, which as an idea has been around for a very long time, and this innovation of being able to space out attention over time, or sorry, attention all at once, essentially. So it's like when you're looking out at the world, you see everything at once, but you still have to pay attention, right? So you might know there's a dog in what you're seeing, but if you had to describe the dog, you would have to pay attention to that dog. And so you can do that by moving your eyes. You can also do it just by moving your attention. And so that's what they've replicated with these new models. But it has always been a black box. And if anyone tells you they know exactly why that next word came out, they're full of, okay, what would that next word be? Probably something semantically related to manure. But if I said they're full of towels, you would be shocked, right? Mm-hmm. That's the learning signal, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's what they're doing, and that's what we do all the time, is we are constantly predicting that next word that's going to be said given the context of recent events. If I'm downstairs washing clothes and I say the laundry basket is full of towels, there's no learning signal, right? That's expected kind of thing. So that's very important to keep in mind when you're using these, is to think about what you want it to pay attention to and how much context it has for producing what it produces.
Thank you, Andrew. Okay, so we're just about ready to get into the use cases. We wanted to share one more thing. I, for the most part, have used Claude the most, and I'll share why. And it was not an arbitrary decision, but it turns out all of these models have been trained differently. We don't know how they're training, what it's been trained on, what text, what content, but it's trained to interact even differently with the people, the humans interacting with them. And all of these models tend to be stronger based on my experience and based on what the industry is saying in different ways. Claude is very much considered the professor of the group, the intellectual of the group, where the reason I'm using Claude is that the responses, the text-based responses that come back have just seemed to initially, when I started to experiment, be much more aligned with what my intention was. And the responses were much more aligned with how I think about research work. By no means does that mean you need to use Claude, but it's thinking about which tool. I'd recommend actually playing with a couple of the models at least and seeing what output you get back to see which more aligns with your expectations and what you're looking for. So that's Claude, who I think of as the professor of the group. ChatGPT-4 in the center is the powerhouse. ChatGPT-4 can do a lot more than I'm even trying to do with my research cases. It's the model to go to if you're wanting to do coding or have it do coding for you. It's integration now with multimodal using Dolly at the same time. I can be putting my prompts into ChatGPT-4. Dolly is also, in addition to, I can get the text-based output, but I can get the images back. So it's a really powerful engine. I called it an engine, a model. Finally, I mentioned I've spent the least amount of time with Gemini. It's not because there's anything wrong with Gemini. I found my model of choice for this first exploration, which was Claude. Gemini, what's really an advantage is the accessibility to your files if you're using Google Drive or Google Docs. One of the nice things is you can integrate Gemini into that ecosystem. So that's a real nice advantage in terms of accessibility to information. I started with Claude. I'll show you an example of why I started with Claude, because I was a little bit, admittedly, early April when I was playing with ChatGPT-4. Sometimes these models just go a little bananas. And here's another thing. Sometimes the people who are working on the models don't even know why. And I think I captured ChatGPT-4 at a moment where it just was not working. So I popped over to Claude. I did want to preface and cite Caitlin Sullivan. I mentioned the getting started with your journey. Caitlin is a UX researcher and customer researcher who I'm following on LinkedIn. I don't know personally. She has fantastic summaries of what's available out there in the UX research, market research, customer research ecosystem. I wanted to share this with you. This is from a recent LinkedIn post that she had. There's so many tools out there for research. I wanted to share, if you want to find one for one specific use case, they're out there. I still would recommend, I admittedly have not played with most of these tools because I'm accomplishing so much with the frontier models. So I'd still recommend, if you haven't played yet, start with one of the LLM frontier models and then go from there. But just so you know, once you have a real foundational understanding of what's happening, there's a whole lot out there for each specific use case you may have. So I highly suggest, if you're not following yet, Caitlin Sullivan has great insight on her LinkedIn profile and on her website. Okay, so let's get started with use cases. So I mentioned after I got the foundations, I started considering my research process. This won't look any different for the most part, the stages of the research process, whether it's qualitative research and discovery research or usability tests. There's typically a similar stages of the process that we're planning our studies, we'll recruit users, we'll moderate the sessions, we'll analyze and synthesize, and then we'll communicate the results. I thought about my typical process. On the left-hand side of the screen, you also see I'm very regimented about my studies. So I have checklists outlining all of my activities for a study. I put this in front of myself as well, so I could start pondering, how did I want to use these tools? And there's questions I asked myself as I was thinking about where to start first. As I mentioned, I wanted to start with one use case. I wondered, in what stage did I hypothesize that the AI models could increase my output and could really increase in terms of optimizing my processes? I thought about that, like where were the stages where I expected models could optimize my workflow? There was another key criteria, and I'm thinking about this in all areas when I'm thinking about how to use these models. Where is the lowest level of risk? And I'll speak to all of you based on what I was seeing in my output. There's areas where even though the AI models can do something, there's areas now where I'm making the decision not to ask it to. And we'll talk about what I mean by risk. What could the risk be involved? But those were the questions I asked. Here's a little teaser. We're going to start with how I used ChatGPT 4 for study planning. I actually started not with study planning. I started with data analysis and synthesis. And the reason was I didn't start small. After meeting with Andrew, I just wanted to see what these models were capable of. So I started with synthesis and summaries to see what would happen, but we're going to start small with study planning. What's nice about this, I have actual data sets that I can work with. So I'll be sharing as we go through this, a real example of a study I conducted. So this is a study I ran in 2023. Why can I put this into the models? It's my study. I own the data. It was an independent study I ran at Perfetti Media with mothers at different stages of their journeys to understand what challenges they have, because moms never have challenges, as we all know. But it was to understand the challenges moms have at the journey. I was running 60-minute interviews with a mix of moms, some who just had newborn babies at home, all the way up to moms who are saying goodbye to their kiddos going to college. And the goal of this study was to learn where the challenges are in the journey, how mothers are working to tackle those challenges, with the end goal. As I mentioned, it's not just about research, it's about getting to outcomes. The end goal was to get to recommendations for interventions that can make life easier for mothers. I ran many interviews. What I'm going to show you is how I used 15 of the interviews to play with the models. So study planning. To start, I started with ChatGPT 4. And what you're seeing here is my first request from the model. It was to assist me with creating a study plan. I wanted to see, with some simple prompting, to what degree I was satisfied with the output from ChatGPT 4. So what you're seeing here at the top, you'll see me prompting the model. ChatGPT 4, you are the best sociological researcher and interviewer in the world. You have specialized expertise in qualitative data collection and analysis. What you're seeing here is me putting in to the model what's known as a UR prompt. For those of us from the world of product and design and research, will love this type of best practice. This is a best practice prompt for the AI models. And the reason is we're giving the model a persona to keep in mind. So I'll talk about whether I've seen it valuable in my work yet, but it's a best practice in terms of working with the models to give the model context in terms of what lens should it be taking on when it's giving you the output back. You'll see that ChatGPT was very polite coming back. Thanks for the introduction. I'm here to help. A little teaser where I love learning from other experts, and I have her information that we'll talk about later. Nicole Leffer, who's doing a lot of work in the marketing space and how to use AI for marketing use cases, has created a UR prompt snippet generator. This prompt at the top, which is really well written, was not written by me. I put into this snippet generator what I was hoping to accomplish with ChatGPT 4, and Nicole Leffer's generator gave me this text to add. So that's the starting point. So after that, after I gave the UR prompt, I prompted ChatGPT 4 with additional information about what I'd like it to do. I'm planning to conduct a qualitative research study with moms who are at different stages of the journey. And I ask it to, as you see, please create a study plan describing how to approach this project. You'll notice that my prompt is very wordy. That's me. That's not best practice of prompting yet. It was me starting to get into the conversational approach with ChatGPT 4. What was interesting with this initial experiment with conversational prompts was the output I got back. And it was okay. So just with those two, the UR prompt and asking ChatGPT-4 to create a study plan, I got an okay starting point for the study plan. It was not bad. And then I put the model to the test, where you notice there's a section where there's recommendations in the output for the type of approach I could use for a study. And there's many different approaches here. If you know me well, you know that I'm not a big fan of focus groups for many reasons, and that will be a topic for another presentation. But what I wanted to put to the test next was, in this study plan, ChatGPT-4 gave me output for different approaches I might take. I wanted to put the engine to the test, and I continued the conversation with follow-up questions. So of the data collection methods you recommended, here are my constraints. I have 4 to 8 weeks. I'd like to get the most in-depth comprehensive data. I wanted to see what would come back. And after that prompt, I got output where the recommendation was, given that you have the 4 to 8 weeks, I'd recommend you start with in-depth interviews. Here's my conclusion. That is where I would start. Going through the study planning to create a study plan and doing these prompts, I thought this was pretty okay in terms of best practices for a starting point for study planning. We'll talk about what my conclusions were and takeaways, but it was okay. As a starting point for thinking through how I might approach a study, it took me, you saw that there's 2 or 3 prompts. It took me 2 minutes to get that output. And it's not what I would have as a final study plan, but it was a nice starting point for me. I then wanted to see, back to the planning stage, to what degree I'd use a model for writing an interview guide. Again, quick prompt. I had some help to write an interview guide for a 60-minute session with moms. And I gave just a general overview of the goals. And then I asked just very quickly with this one prompt, please provide me with a draft. I got a draft back. It wasn't exactly what I would ask. And after this, I realized, and I did this intentionally, back to putting the models to the test. Like me, most likely all of you meet with your stakeholders before you put together an interview guide to find out from them what major themes and questions we want answered from a study. You noticed in the prompting, I did not give the model any of those themes. So what came back was an interview guide that wasn't super focused. But what happens when I iterate on the prompt? And you'll see, after I got that general interview guide, I provided a bit more context and background for what I'm looking for. This is based on thinking through what the goals were for the study, what themes we would want to delve into with mothers. I provided the model with those themes and said, please revise the interview guide by prioritizing the following topics and themes. And what came back was much closer. I'd say it was about 70% in terms of overlap with the types of questions I'd ask. So not bad. Where I found, based on how I conduct research, where from the planning stage, where I expect that I'll use ChatGPT-4, Claude, or Gemini the most, is providing a second set of eyes and feedback and advice and coaching, back to thinking about these models as partners. Another use case I went through was, I actually last year created my own interview guide for these studies. In this example, I attached the draft of the interview guide that I actually had used and asked ChatGPT for feedback. What's really interesting about this, and this is part of the model's training, when I said, please review the guide, please give me recommendations on how I can improve it, it starts with some nice compliments for me in terms of the guide being well, and then it provides some recommendations for enhancing. Now, here's where I started finding more value from Claude at this stage in the process, and models are always being trained and changed over time. This was a very generic response to me. And what I mean by this was, what ChatGPT was returning was less about what I had actually written in my interview guide. It was more just general recommendations for how to write a good interview. So an example of this was, limit leading questions And ChatGPT 4 talked in concept about how you'd like to ask more open-ended questions. This question that's in here that says, instead of asking what challenges did you face with your teenage children, that's not a question in my guide. ChatGPT 4 was giving, in general, here's some things you may fix. Contrast that with, I asked the exact same prompt to Claude, and the responses I was getting back were just more aligned with responses that would be helpful for me to improve upon my guide. It pulled from specific questions I had in my interview guide and gave some feedback there. So in terms of, it's just a starting point. I'd recommend you play with a few of the models and see what works for you. Claude has been my go-to for a few weeks now. So takeaways, we're going to talk about next. This was just basic, simple, how I might use planning. Why I started with planning in this session was like back to thinking about what use cases you want to focus on with the models. I found planning to be a very low risk stage. So planning was, how might I use this tool to augment what I'm already thinking or get the ball rolling a little bit? And I found that the models performed well as a planning partner. What I also found is it's okay and it's good. It's not as good as a skilled researcher at putting together a study plan and an interview guide. And that's okay. This is not a replacement for our work, but it's a way to optimize our work and augment it in some cases. One thing that I've been thinking a lot about, and it's less of a concern, it will come up more when we talk about summarizing and synthesizing, is in what ways, by working with these models, does it take away from the time I'm thinking through studies? And I'm already starting to think about that. With these, I'm planning on using for planning in the short term, and this may change over time. I really appreciated uploading my interview guide and getting some feedback on ways I could improve it. And guess what? Even after doing this for 25 years, there's ways I can improve. And as a partner in that process, once I had the interview guide, it was fantastic. I also think back to there being low levels of risk, as I'm working with stakeholders and clients to think through what types of studies I may run. I already have in my mind, after I talk to my clients about their objectives and the questions they have, what study I want to run. But it's really helpful, back to having another partner to run things by, to ask Claude or ChatGPT 4, how might you structure this study, asking for a study plan. I like doing a lot of the thinking work before I ask the models. The way to think about this, I recently listened to, and I can't recommend it enough. You can tell I'm a fan of Ethan Mollick at this point with his book, but he was on the Ezra Klein show, the podcast, and they spent a lovely 90 minutes talking about when to decide whether to use the models or not. And I love the approach that was recommended, thinking about they call it the BAH standard, the best available human, and asking yourself, when you're working with these models, is it more or less accurate than, your colleague at the next desk? And sure, these models aren't, as we've talked about, they're not conscious. They're predictive models of words, but are there ways that it could still augment your process? And that's what I've been thinking a lot about. So with that, we're going to get into the meaty synthesis and recommendations in a minute, but I do see that there's been a lot of chat comments. So Andrew, I did want to ask, before we jump into more of the meaty synthesis and recommendations, teaser for all of you, this was day 2 for me, and day 2 was when my mind was blown for the first time. So I'm excited to get into that. But before I do, Andrew, any pressing comments or questions or considerations?
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion around using these models with your data, right?
Yep.
And what are the implications around that? Have you agreed with your subjects that's allowed?
Yep.
And different models and different plans will say explicitly or not whether or not your data will be used for training for the next round, right?
Absolutely. In the training, so first things first, any study you're doing, using best practices for research, having your informed consent form already, having that. Last week's workshop with Andrea was fantastic in terms of making sure that your informed consent is now asking your participants for informed consent and approval for using their anonymous data with third-party tools. And as she recommended, this should have been in informed consents years ago, but with AI, that's even more necessary. A very key point about getting informed consent. There's another key aspect here. I have not yet put data in from any client work for specific privacy reasons, and I don't share my client work with anyone ever. The example here, and this will be very important, is that this is a study that I run where all of the transcripts, it's so important to take out any PII, personally identifiable information, and making sure that you do that as well. So there's a lot around privacy, and there's a lot of implications here. When I've been talking with clients, the only data sets I've worked with are data sets where I'm rubbing them so clean that you actually lose some of the in-depth detail, but there's no possible way to identify this and attach it to a person because that's so crucial. When I've been talking with clients, there's been the big discussion. First, I'm not using any of their client work, but there's been the implication of the fear even by organizations to have their employees work with this data because of the proprietary information and the private information. And it's something that we need to really delve deeply into. I asked you about this, Andrew, if you recall, where I was getting a lot of questions from researchers around how do I ensure if I'm working in-house that we're maintaining privacy. And you had mentioned, and I haven't played with them as much, but the enterprise plans for some of ChatGPT-4 has an enterprise plan where it's saying that none of the content will be used for any sort of training and maintaining the privacy for an organization. But to the point everyone's talking about in the chat, this is a really important consideration. I've thought a lot about too how I update my informed consent to ensure that it counts for any possible way we may want to use this in the future. But in the short term, I think a barrier to entry for me is still, I don't intend to ever use my client data. Like I'm not ready to share that. I'm curious what other people's perspective was.
Yeah, they're saying there are those plans, like you mentioned, and
Yeah,
I see it as you've got a lot of information on Google Drive, right? So you're trusting
yeah,
that to be secure. The training, you do need to make sure it's not being used for training.
yeah,
That means if someone were to ask a similar question later, it's going to come out and you'll show that later with your hallucination. It's like,
yeah,
well, it's
absolutely.
read transcripts of interviews before, right?
Yeah.
The chances are small, but possible that, and people have done studies of this, of how can I figure out who this person is, right?
Yeah.
And the data is there if you know how to find it.
Yeah, there's another important implication here. And I saw research back to Ethan Mollick. If you're not following him yet, you should be. He posted yesterday, he was citing research done with employees that the takeaway was 80% of employees were saying that they were using one of these models in some way integrated into their work. But what the implication was, it's not for most enterprises or small businesses, 80% of employees, like they're not all giving permission. So one of the inferences from that study was that employees and workers are using their own personal accounts sometimes to be doing this work. And another scary implication, we as researchers and product practitioners and who are always really protecting the privacy of our users, this is where we have another place to play in this discourse. What about all of these employees from other fields that aren't having informed consents or asking people to be recorded who are putting data into these models, like there's a lot of implications where I expect that UX practitioners and researchers can be on the forefront of saying, here's some guardrails we need. Because in all of our work, we're thinking through these considerations. My question is, for those 80% of people who say that they're integrating these process AI into their life, are they thinking about it even to the level of depth we are? And we're still scared. So there's just a lot to think about there. So thank you for the questions. I'm going to jump ahead and I'd love to stop another couple of times, but I wanted to talk about the synthesis and recommendations, where back to, you want to clean all of the data you're putting in. You also want to make sure you have permission. You also, in the workshop that I attended last week with Andrew and I, just like thinking through, you want to check with your company about their privacy policies. I'm not internal at a company, and this is data that was for my independent studies, but you want to think through those before you start putting data and uploading it in. This is an example of the discovery interviews, and this was my first experiment and exploration into adding a transcript. I didn't take all 15 transcripts and upload it. I start small, where I provided one interview summary, one transcript, and I attached the transcript and asked, and also not including for training data as well, but I attached the request for taking the raw transcript and extracting answers to some questions. And I asked, what you're seeing here are the questions that I had in my interview guide to give Claude some context there. Now, what you'll want to think through, I'm showing you some snippets of my use cases. We all have somewhat different processes. When you're thinking through how you might test out these tools for discovery, there's a series of steps you take. Most of you probably summarize one user transcript at a time or user notes, and then you move on to the next step to see what participants said for each question. I'm going to show you an example of how I went about summarizing the data. So I first gave Claude one transcript and asked for some responses back to what were the top themes that came out for the specific questions that came up in my interview guide for just one transcript. I then uploaded a second transcript, again, starting slowly to work with the model. And then I asked Claude to do the same analysis again. Hallucinations. One time when I was first going through this process, I said to the model that I was going to attach a raw transcript from an interview with a mom. And I asked and requested that they extract answers to the questions. And the model does what I asked. It extracted answers to the questions. The problem was I forgot to upload a transcript. So this was data unrelated to anything in my study. It was made up, or if not made up, coming from other content that the model was trained on. This happens, and it's also a really important implication to consider under what circumstances this happens. So my big lesson learned already, you'll hear about the risks of hallucinations. You'll hear about not knowing whether these models are taking from the data sets you provide versus any sort of literature or training that it's gotten out in the world. And it's something that we as researchers really need to think about. And the discourse I've been having with other professionals is we can optimize our processes, but if we're optimizing, we also have to ensure that the quality stays just as high, if not higher. And hallucinations brought into play with me for when I first started working with them to start thinking through, this is a little scary. And how do I vet and analyze that what's coming back is actually real? I did go through yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's an example of it's just predicting the next word, right? It doesn't know what it's doing. You gave it all this context, but I think this will be changing, right? In the next models, the next iterations of these is it doesn't have a frontal lobe, right? So it's not monitoring itself very well. And the right response would be like, oh, you forgot to attach your transcript, right?
Yeah.
But instead, at this stage, at least, these models are saying, oh, here's a likely output based off what you just said. And so there it's relying on all the data it's been trained on. So really there are interviews with mothers somewhere in that training data that it could pull from.
Yep.
Um, that's that's something to be very aware of and conscious of. And even on objective benchmarks for these models, they're getting 40 to maybe 80, 90% correct on just objective data, let alone your specific use case. You have to double check everything.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. Thank you, Andrew. In terms of, I then went through the process, uploaded a few more. And why I wanted to show you in terms of when I use these models. So I uploaded a few more transcripts, gave the same request to, based on the interview questions I asked, start organizing the responses by the participants according to those questions. And the reason why I bring this up is it was my first really wow experience when interacting with the AI. I've been a skeptic throughout this entire process. What I found I found very impressive out of this, and it's where I think there could be promise, is the summarizing. We know AI is known for summarizing large data sets and finding patterns in the data. Part of my process of synthesizing interview data is that I know my research goals for a study. I know what questions I ask. The questions I ask in an interview guide align with my goals for the study. And one of the first ways I start synthesizing and understanding data is by organizing the responses I got from participant by the question I asked them. And it's a really manual process, at least the way I do it. It's usually a lot of, I'll use Google Documents, and it's a lot of cutting and pasting for me, like putting participant data in certain categories. It took the model about an hour with my prompting to do what usually takes me a couple of days. And that was a wow moment. And the question is, it's not asking the model to provide recommendations, but it was a great, powerful moment to see this might be a big opportunity to optimize. There's other implications here, however. So this was my wow moment where I thought, wow, there could be something here in terms of how I use these models as a partner for my work. But there's another implication here, which I'm spending, and it's where I want to start a discourse with the research community, where I get so much value. It's not the fun part of my job, but when I'm talking about the manual work I do to look at the interview transcripts and start looking at what the answers were to each question and cutting and pasting and putting the participants' information in there, it takes me 2 days. And I think of it as laborious, but it's 2 days that I'm really starting to think through the problem space and what I've learned. And a question I'm asking myself is that it was really promising that I could cut my time down from 2 days to 15 minutes. And I'm still questioning, I can do that. And this is a discourse that's coming up in the AI field, is what do we lose when we're optimizing our workflow? I'm losing a little bit of that time that I use to think through a problem. And I've been thinking a lot, and I'd be curious as people use this, like I'm still one of the people leaning on the side of, I can use these tools a lot. Will I or would I if it will shortcut my process? But it also comes back to what types of studies will I use these models? And we'll talk about this. I don't think I will tend to use them as much for strategic, in-depth discovery projects where the thinking through the problems, not just on my end, but with the teams, are so key. But these were some of my takeaways. It summarizes well. It's what AI is known for. It works really well. Recommendations. Again, I wanted to see the types of recommendations I get back from the engines. And so I asked questions like, based on the answers to the questions and what you saw from the patterns in the data, what are some recommendations for interventions? And the models will always give you recommendations back. But the question I had, and I know it's something Andrew's thinking about in his development work, I'm getting really compelling and persuasive recommendations back from ChatGPT 4 and Claude. And the challenge I'm having when I am synthesizing my own data and working with teams, we know we're working off of the same data set. And what I don't yet always know with the models, is it really only working with the data set I provided, or is it pulling from other sources? So there's that component. Some rules of thumb here to think about that, to vet where this data is coming from, is asking the models for more information. So when it gives you recommendations, asking for accompanying quotes from the interviews, asking for where these citations came from, asking for the rationale in your prompting behind the recommendations, to start ensuring that whatever the recommendations are tied back to your real data set turns out to be really important. I'll tell you all flat out, and Andrew knows this, on day 3, I was like, wow, these engines did reduce my workflow from 2 days to 15 to 30 minutes or 60 minutes. I don't intend at this stage and where we are with the models to use the models as my main partner for providing recommendations. And there's a few reasons for synthesizing and recommending. And part of the reason for that is I still truly believe that it's important for the humans to think through the problem and synthesize the data and come up with recommendations. Where I do see the model could be really helpful in augmenting my work is once I've come up with the team and collaborating with recommendations, asking as another side partner, asking the models, what additional recommendations might you have? So using it as a complement after the synthesis and recommendations have been done. So that's where I've landed. I'm sure others have landed elsewhere. I've asked other experts in the space, like, how do we decide when to use the models or not? Just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. And where we are right now in this frontier is it's up to us to decide. So I'm sharing with you where I am on the spectrum. You may be at a different point, but it goes back to the question of balancing out how much we can optimize versus the level of risk. And for my leaning, there's still a whole lot of level of risk to be outsourcing too much of the recommendations and summaries. So that's where I stand right now on that topic. Final thing before we stop for questions again, another area where I see there being a real opportunity with our use cases to get value from the models is for communicating with our partners and stakeholders. And what I mean by that, one thing that I talk with my clients about and other researchers and product practitioners is that we need to know our audience. And our audience in-house is typically the folks at the C-level as well as our partners. And I've thought a lot through when I'm constructing my recommendations and my summaries and my slide deck deliverables, I do see using these models as a partner to help think through, hey, I'm going to be presenting these findings to the CEO. How might I want to position this in a way that would be most compelling? And not having the model my presentation, but helping me think through as a communicator how I could best present the results. And that could be a compelling opportunity as well. There was another area that I wanted to highly recommend as well. I mentioned that last week I attended a course. It's Andrea Knight-Dolan's course. And what I did come away with, and it was so valuable, you've been seeing a little bit of my prompting, which is admittedly really verbose, chatty prompting. Another big takeaway from her course is the degree to which prompting still matters a lot in terms of this work. So collecting tips from others with a high degree of expertise has been super, super valuable. Something that I had not thought about as much was using these models to help you with your first draft of a PowerPoint deck. And I learned a lot of great prompts about how to get that starting point from Andrea to create a PowerPoint deck and images. So this is another way to say, I've been hearing a lot from the experts in the space as I've been doing my research that over time, prompting is going to be less important over time as the models learn and can predict us and what we're looking for. But as of now, I am still getting a lot of value from the expertise in the space and the field to refine my prompts as well. So I am going to stop there and I have a couple more use cases I want to show you, but let's stop for a couple of minutes, Andrew, if there's any other questions.
Not so many questions. People are sharing kind of their experiences. And yeah, hallucinations are definitely an issue.
Okay.
And one way to think about that, at least in your case, is that they a lack of information or a lack of data is not something that you can pay attention to, right? So if there's something you haven't said, it's again, there's nothing to point to say, okay, here's a negative, and I'm gonna work off that negative. And it's just not how they work. And so that's always something to be aware of, I think, when you're using these tools.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Since there's so much chatting, there were a couple of other topics, and I'm going to spend about another 10 minutes talking through some things that have been my big takeaways and go through a couple of other use cases. I'd love to take a look at that chat window and see what people are saying. So when we wrap up, I couldn't end a conversation about this topic without talking about legal and ethical implications. And I only wanted to spend a couple of minutes on this, but the reason I'm bringing this up, and I'm so glad it's also coming up in the chat when we were talking about maintaining privacy, making sure we're asking for the informed consent, making sure we've updated the informed consents to ask the right permission from all of these things matter. And there's so many implications where I think UX professionals, product researchers, we can be at the forefront of these discussions because it's something we're thinking about all of the time. And there's both the legal implications and the ethical implications, and we're not going to go into a lot of legalese, but some things that we as practitioners should also be thinking about and thinking about what our take is and what we want to contribute to this discourse. So Noam Chomsky, expert linguist, pioneer in the linguistic space, has described these AI models, thanks to Louis Susi. He posted about this yesterday, this excellent video from Noam Chomsky, where he describes artificial intelligence as sophisticated high-tech plagiarism. And that use case is a little different than our use case of we're not going out and taking authors' books. But there's a piece of this here that the models we're working with, we don't know what they've been trained on. Authors, writers, artists, all of their research is part of this puzzle. And there's truth to this as we figure out this new frontier. We're talking about on our scale, how we get informed consent from our participants, rightfully. Are these companies building these models giving any sort of same level of discourse around how they're thinking about the creators of the content that they're using to train? And it's really important. And I wanted to point out to all of you, just during my initial work, it's something that's come to mind a ton. Day 4 with Andrew, I told him I'm scared. There's things that I like to think of myself, having spent 25 years in this field, where I have an element, and many of us, we all do have our own thought leadership. We have our own writing. And what prevents any of these models from taking that and saying the same thing and acting like us? And there isn't anything right now. So I did just want to encourage you all, as you're having these discussions, there are places who are considering this. Just learned about the Algorithmic Justice League, which is thinking all about how do we make AI more equitable and accountable, and thinking about what that means. We talked about for our research the importance of consent. What about for these creators whose models are trained on their work? There's consent. There's compensation, there's credit, there's control. And it's so important what we're talking about, the privacy for these interview transcripts, so important. This is so important. What are we training on, and how are we thinking through these issues? Admittedly, we talk a lot about the bias of these models. I just wanted to share with all of you, there's great real life implications to think about this beyond just the dangers of bias of models and what the implications are. I just listened. I'm a big fan of Brene Brown and her podcast. She talked yesterday and published an amazing conversation with Dr. Joy Bolamwini, and it was amazing in that She's been doing incredible work to understand the implications of AI. She ran a study where she was looking at, it's called the Gender Shades Project, which was looking at the accuracy of AI-powered gender classification products. And the findings are just mind-blowing in terms of, guess what? These models are very good at classifying certain people and not as good with others. So all of the companies were performing better on lighter subjects as a whole than darker subjects as a whole. Implications like that, what does that mean? She talked a lot about the work she's doing to protect people and citizens, work around the Brooklyn tenants group who had to fight landlords who wanted to put facial recognition requirements before entering their own apartment complexes. There's real world implications to this bias. And as researchers, back to why I'm even bringing this up, I started the whole conversation saying to become proficient, we can start working with these models for our own use cases. But to really have a discussion into the broader implications for our industries and our fields, we have a big opportunity to start researching out how these models are being used and where they're running into problems, and based on our expertise, being a part of the dialogue. And that's where I think from a research perspective, we can contribute to such a great extent the more proficient we become with the models. So to wrap up, I'm not going to go through all of my prompting. You probably noticed that we focused far less on the prompting and more about the implications of using the models and when we would want to do the prompting. There's some areas where, again, the models are very good at finding patterns and summarizing and synthesizing and providing recommendations. Analyzing open-ended survey responses, really great in terms of first run-throughs. I did want to share, people have asked me, are there any circumstances where I would let the models run the show a little bit? No, from a research perspective, expect to, as the human, as part of this partnership with my stakeholders in-house, my teammates, human teammates on the cross-functional teams, we are going to run a lot of the show. The question I'm asking myself is to what degree I will partner with these models to bring them on board. And there's certain areas which we've talked about. When I'm thinking about this, I think about the model strengths, which we've talked a lot about, and I think about risk. One area where I'm thinking that I envision, and I've talked with colleagues about this, where I see AI being a partner that could optimize my flow with very little risk. When I've been in-house establishing research programs for companies, I've tended to focus on the strategic, in-depth discovery projects to figure out what the long-term and short-term strategy and vision is for the organization. But guess what? Like me, you probably get a lot of requests for, hey, our usability studies with 3 to 5 participants, we want to test out a particular part of our UI. I still want to drive the show where I work with the teams and partner with them to structure the study and run the study. But when we've done a 3 to 5 participant usability study where my team is observing the tests and we've quickly run an exercise to analyze the data, I'm starting to think I'll have very little problem after I've actively involved with the team to ask Claude or ChatGPT-4 to take the output from our team collaboration debriefing and put together my 1 to 2 pager summarizing what we learned. It's a study where I've been involved, the teams have been involved, and I don't have the time or bandwidth to spend the 2 to 3 hours to put together my 2-pager. That's an area where I could involve. But here's the key. I would only do that if the team had already been actively involved and been collaborating with me to synthesize the results. Final thing here, and big fan, if you listen to nothing else this week, the conversation with Brene Brown was fascinating. This was a key point I thought about, where there's use cases that I won't be using the models for the short term, at least. Wonderful quote by Dr. Jo Bolamwini, where she's saying, it's easy to underestimate the art forms that aren't your own. And I thought about research practices, how it's so easy to underestimate why we do what we do. And it's so easy just to decide, yep, we can optimize it. And examples where I've landed right now, we can use these models to create personas, for example. I will not, and I won't show you any prompting of it, because the power, based on my experience of creating personas for 25 years, is that the power is not in having the one-page persona description and the goals. The power is having worked first, immersing the team in the data. They've observed the users, going through exercises where we cluster the people and figure out where their patterns were, getting the whole organization on board to see how we got here. The power was not in the page persona. The power is how you collaborate with your teams. And a lot of times where people underestimate the power of a researcher's work and how they're collaborating, that page is not the power of our persona. The persona is just encompasses everything we've done along the line to get to the value. I admittedly have not done this, and I don't expect I will using any AI moderated studies. I think there's so much power in skilled human practitioner researchers leading the show and moderating. I'm not planning on interviewing any synthesized users anytime in the future. And it all goes back to, just because we could do something doesn't mean I should. And that's where I've really landed there. I know this has been coming up in the channel, but something I grapple with this a lot. We're all doing so much research. What should we give to the models versus not? And there are settings we can put to make sure it's not included in training data. I have spent, when I said that I've saved so much time, where it went from 2 days to, what did I say, 60 minutes? I've spent more time scraping and cleaning my transcripts to take out anything remotely, possibly anything related to PII, and not just scanning. I've read every transcript. So then I start thinking pros and cons. I'm admittedly still very cautious about what I'm giving these models. And it's something we really need to think about. Thinking about where I found the most value. I mentioned I'm a skeptic. There's many who are less skeptical and many who are much more proficient at prompting than I am. Like, there's other power, especially what I was learning last week from Andrea in her session. There's so much you can pull in terms of literature and citations and reviews. I, right now, at my level of expertise, only have felt comfortable working with my data sets where I know where they're coming from and I know that they're high quality. And the whole discussion around bias, I think the more we as researchers and product managers and marketers really start discussing the real life implications of bias. There's a lot of folks talking about the bias in the models, but the more we can talk about those real life implications, the better. So I've learned a lot from these 6 weeks, and there's still so much I would like to learn. I'm hoping, as we talked about, Andrew and I were discussing, our big goal is, it sounds like a bunch of you have been really already very proficient with these models. The one request I'd have is, how do we start having a discourse as a community to talk about how we're using these models for our use cases, but take it to the next level, all of these legal, ethical, quality implications. I think we have a major role to play here. So that's what we came to talk to you about. I'll be sending out the slide decks. I've talked about all of these wonderful resources. These were the resources that helped me the most in this 6-week whirlwind tour. You heard me referencing Ethan Mollick quite a bit. I'm a big fan. I also can't recommend enough Andrea Knight Dolan's. She has a 3-hour course that walks through so many different types of qualitative and quantitative use cases. The prompts that I was learning from her were just amazing. So it's excellent. And Caitlin Sullivan is doing great work. Nicole Leffer, lots of great stuff out here. This will be in the deck when I share it. And thank you. If you found any of this interesting, Andrew and I are both on LinkedIn. I'm really passionate about those of us who are at this same place, really trying to understand the implications, having more conversations about this. So please add me and Andrew and start a conversation with us. We'd really appreciate that. Andrew, I'm going to ask, we have a few minutes for questions. Andrew, would you mind putting the survey for today's session in the chat window as well? I really highly, this is my first time and Andrew's first time presenting what we learned from our whirlwind tour of research use cases. I'd love to get your feedback if you could spend a couple of minutes filling that out. We're also planning a training cohort with more in-depth discussions of the use cases. So if you're also interested in hearing about that, I put a question in the survey to ask a little bit about that. So that's what we came to talk about. I'm wondering any questions or I'm so excited to see what's been happening in the chat window. Andrew, can you just give me, before we go to a question, a high-level summary? It seemed like the proficiency of the group was pretty high in terms of using the tools.
Yeah, we had maybe a third actually use them daily. Another third have used them some. And then actually it's probably 50-50 of those who said something. But yeah, everyone is very nervous about sharing data with these tools.
Oh, absolutely. I am too. And it's making sure you have consent, making sure that any PII is removed. Thank you, Andrea, for also, I see Andrea Knight Dolan's comment where absolutely, we need to be asking for permission for third parties or affiliated companies. Also, I can't even tell you, I'm saying how much time is optimized, but going through, and it's something I didn't think about. Carrie will know this. When Carrie Coe and I were first talking about this, I was like, oh, what should we take out or not? Now that I see these models, I'm going through line by line these interviews to take out anything, like taking out location too. But then even these moms interviews, when I talked to each of these moms, like I'm so scared and I'm thinking about the risk, but all of the moms said, oh, I'm just talking about my kids for a little bit. Not to say it doesn't matter, but I'm scared about it. I feel a lot of risk. It's my research training in me. I would ask us all think about though, how could we be part of this broader discussion about models are training on work that they have not asked for, published work. So there's our discussion at our level, and it's the same discussion we need to have at the broader level. And how can we contribute to it? Yeah, so Brene Brown, not happy that models are being trained on her work. So same sort of thing. Questions that are coming up?
Yeah, please raise your hand if you have a question. I think you brought up another way to think about how to use these tools, which is process versus product, right? If the process itself is important, like it was with your persona creation, yeah, you don't want to use these tools. If just the product, it'll produce a product, that one-page persona, it can just do that. Right. But that's like you said, that is not actually the goal. The process is the goal. The product is the result of that. And I think about it's like if you enjoy writing, you should write. If there's some grunt work kinds of writing that have to be done, fine. Yeah. If you don't enjoy it, don't then use these AI tools to do it for you. And so that's the way I'm thinking about it. And when we first started, you mentioned you've been sitting on this data for a year because you're afraid of all that grunt work you're going to have to do, and it was just the not fun part of it, right?
Yeah.
And so by using AI, you had something in a day.
Yeah. And to be fair, there's implications, like where a couple of things you said. If you don't like writing, use AI, and I'll still be the skeptic. I have used the models now long enough to know, and I'm sure many of you do, you know when there's something that's AI versus something that's not. So there's always yes, and like you don't like writing, you could try to use AI, but it's just a little partner. Don't have AI write all of your writing. The saving me time. Yeah, I was sitting on data that was mine. It prompted me by seeing the summary. It motivated me to do my work. Like it was like, oh, this was broad stroke, high level insight. What I fear, and it's what I've been hearing from other use cases, and I'm curious if it's happening in the research space, is that the output is so persuasive and compelling. I fear that it's a human, it's an innate human quality that we look for shortcuts in our work. And I fear that when we're looking for shortcuts, we can turn to this persuasive, compelling output. And my question still, is it the quality we need? It's something that I think about. I'm not staying up late, like overnight thinking about it, but it's something I think about a lot, is that to what degree will people use shortcuts to the point where we won't have this level of discourse because there's so much compelling output? It's an implication. Thank you, thank you, thank you, everyone. I just posted, if you have time, I appreciate your time today. If you have time, I just posted the Survey Monkey for today's session. We'd love to get your feedback, and I so appreciate all of the discourse. Thank you so much for attending.